Thank you so much for inviting us to be a part of this Book Bites program. Kristen and I are very excited to be here and talk about our publication, which is We Will Always Be Here, and is a book especially for teens and really looks at primary sources, and we'll explore what all of that means coming up now.
So here's a little bit of our roadmap for today. We're going to tell you a little bit of how this book came about, why this source material, why we're writing it. We wrote it now and presenting it now. And then we'll dive into some of those sources, sharing about one per chapter. We'll share with you a little bit from each chapter. And then after that, we'll talk about where we go from here. And then we'll let you go.
So the very first thing we want to do is really take some time to orient ourselves in time and space. Within this book, we cover about 100 years of history, and tonight we will be sharing a few thematic stories as we go. But most of us think in a linear fashion, so we like to start with this timeline, which is in the book, in order to kind of give us that time span. Ultimately, we know that people who would identify as part of the LGBTQ community have been in Wisconsin for as long as there have been people that lived in what we now know of as Wisconsin. Earlier sources are just harder to locate, and sources can be hard to find in general or look different. And most early histories are actually in the form of an oral history, oral tradition, or court cases. And in the written record is typically where a lot of historians live because we have really tangible sources then. And we made a decision that we wanted to focus on moments in this history of agency and of activism, which is why we'll be talking about some stories that many of us probably never heard of before we came upon this book. But our story really starts actually in 1914 in Milwaukee with a court case involving a person named Ralph Coinio, who was arrested for cross-dressing. One of the amazing things about Ralph's story, even though it is one of those court cases, you see a lot of agency and activism because in interviews, he had these amazing quotes about celebrating his identity and living life on his own terms. We then continue on kind of through this time span into the 1920s with authors and people who made the most of the flapper era like Glenway Westcott, and on to the story of Bob and Edgar in Mineral Point living through the Depression and World War II. And our early stories especially are about ideas of surviving and thriving in a small scale community and in everyday actions. Because until Stonewall, that's really kind of the activism that we see is being true to yourself is an amazingly brave and resilient thing to do. And the amazing thing about Wisconsin is that in this history, we are a national leader in legislation. Lloyd Barbie introduces a bill to decriminalize homosexuality in Wisconsin in 1967, which is 2 years before Stonewall. And Wisconsin becomes the first state to pass a non-discrimination law in the country in 1982. Wisconsinites' voices are loud and proud on the national scale of LGBTQ history.
So just like the timeline, we really wanted to give readers, teens especially, a geographic frame of reference. We wanted teens to be able to look at this map and see how LGBTQ plus activism was spread throughout the state of Wisconsin. So our hope is that teens can look at this map and be able to point to a city or a town or a village nearest them and know that this history is not just something that happens in big cities far away. It happens in their own backyards, and they too can contribute to history.
So we just ran through a number of points in history, but the reality is that many of the names we've never heard of, and we've never heard a lot of these individual stories. But there is genuine interest among our youth to learn about our LGBTQ history and activism. For over 10 years, I've been involved in a program called National History Day, which is a project where students get to choose what topic in history they're going to study. And every year that I was involved, I would repeatedly see projects of the Lavender Menace, the Well, Stonewall, and more. Our youth want to know these stories, and every generation has had to fight to find stories of people like them. All of that is changing though, and this book is a direct outgrowth of the work of Dr. Richard Wagner, who is pictured here on the slide. Wagner is the best human to have written the 2-volume gay history series you see on the slide. We've been here all along, and coming out moving forward is his 2-volume set that is like the definitive history. It has so much detail. I highly recommend them. He had a PhD in history, was active in Wisconsin politics, and lived much of the gay history in his 2nd volume. It was his personal collection that allowed such an amazing series to even occur, including our book. So he collected and then wrote these stories as the great historian that he was. As part of the fundraising efforts that he undertook for those books with the Wisconsin Historical Society, the groups and donors he worked with believed that there should be a teen outreach piece, an educational aspect to this work. His book, while amazing in so many ways, were a bit long and written at a little bit higher level than perhaps a lot of teens would be interested in. So that is when we decided we were going to do something, right? How do we get here? Well, the next question was, what exactly are we going to do? What are we going to do to connect to these teens? I was the coordinator of secondary education at the Wisconsin Historical Society at the time, and they came to me for almost everything teen. So they gave me Dick's books, they took in my gender and women's history background, and they asked what I would do. I turned to the best practices of what was happening in classrooms, and we landed on a primary source reader with a focus on activism and a strong teen voice that would run throughout the book. Working with a group called Urban Underground in Milwaukee gave me this phrase that I love that we really brought into this book as well, which is nothing about us without us. So teens were going to be directly involved in the process of creating this book from the start. And that is something that we're really proud of that came to fruition. Thankfully, as I was just starting to feel overwhelmed with this massive project, the fabulous Kristen Whitson and I reconnected again at a conference, and her archival expertise and my educational background created the perfect partnership that would allow us to create this book.
So our book, We Will Always Be Here, is what's called a primary source reader. And for anybody who's not familiar with that, well, a primary source reader is a book that points readers, teens in this case, and anybody else who reads the book, to original historical resources with a little bit of explanation and context around each source. We were excited to take this opportunity to introduce primary sources to our teen audience and perhaps be able to underscore what they're already learning in the classroom about primary sources. Primary sources are anything that was written or created at the time of an event, witnessed by a person in the moment, anything recorded by that primary person. So letters, newspapers, objects, today even tweets are all considered to be primary sources. Speeches, diaries, and photographs are primary sources too. So the sign in this picture, a notice from the Stonewall Inn raid in New York City in June 1969. This sign is a primary source. An oral history from someone who was there at Stonewall that night would be considered a primary source. By contrast, a textbook, a research paper, and our book are all considered secondary sources because they analyze and contextualize and talk about the primary sources. Our interpretation of the events of Stonewall is a secondary source. And when studying history, it's important to understand the difference between primary and secondary sources and when to use each primary resources for historical research in particular, which is what we wanted to share with the teen readers.
We also want to take this opportunity to acknowledge that not all primary sources are created equally. And we certainly took that into account when choosing which sources were going to be appearing in our book and also be offered to teens to even review. We know that not all sources are truthful, authentic, or available. So we took a concerted effort to make sure that the best sources we could were the ones that would appear in this book. So once we had this base of primary sources, we ended up creating an organizational structure that was thematic. Each chapter of the book was organized based on a kind of activism. As we go forward, we'll outline each of those forms of activism, I like calling this our spectrum of activism, a phrase that I like when talking about LGBTQ activism, especially because of the association of spectrums and rainbows, but also because, like gender and sexuality, our identity is fluid, as activism is fluid. There are no two actions alike, and just because no individuals are alike, so their actions cannot be either. There are times when being yourself is the bravest thing that you can do. There is no sense in measuring one form of action as harder, better, or worse than another. Moreover, activism can be a loaded term, and we understand that it makes people worried at points. But ultimately, we all partake in forms of activism on a daily basis. If you woke up this morning and turned on the news to learn about what was currently happening in the world, that is a form of activism. You are purposely trying to seek out information to be a better educated person in this world. That is an action that you make as purposefully as any other. We then chose stories that are following this thematic structure throughout the book. And what was really amazing about our process is Kristen, with her fantastic archival background, was able to pull together kind of a critical mass of sources. And then we worked with teens to choose which ones are going to appear in the book. We wanted to make sure that we were honoring this past legacy, but also that we were bringing forward sources that were still relevant and engaging to our teens today. And I mean that seriously, because if it were just my book, I would have included a Miss Guernsey sash in the pages, which was from a Central Wisconsin drag beauty pageant, but it didn't resonate with our teens. Maybe because of their cow knowledge wasn't quite as high as mine, right? We have all these intersectioning identities. I thought it was epic because there was a Holstein pattern on this sash, and it was a Miss Guernsey pageant. So the cows there, of course, are different if you have cow knowledge. So I just thought it was a hilarious example of really being tongue-in-cheek and playful in the way that we have our Wisconsin dairy identity coming into the LGBTQ history as well. But our teens did not get the same kick out of it that I did, and it is not in the book, which is completely fair because there are so many things that we could put in this book. It could be volumes and volumes. What we winnowed it down to were 5 to 7 primary sources, and therefore 5 to 7 distinct stories in each of the chapters. We cover over 100 years of history and crisscross Wisconsin. And we're going to share just a few of these stories with you now.
So first on our list of types of activism in chapter 1 is educating oneself. And as we go through each chapter, we're going to sort of switch off between reading a little bit from the book and then explaining a little bit about each source. So in chapter 1, we say, what we learn shapes us into the people we become. We are taught by our teachers, families, and friends, but we must also take our education into our own hands and seek out topics that matter to us. This is especially true of topics that don't normally come up in classrooms or in casual conversations. One way to learn more about LGBTQ+ issues is by reading materials created by local and regional LGBTQ+ groups and organizations. Today, you might try visiting websites or finding groups on social media, but in the early 1970s, organizations such as the Gay People's Union, or GPU, in Milwaukee printed and distributed their own newspapers, and some groups still do this today. Founded by UW-Milwaukee students in 1971, the GPU was an incredibly important LGBTQ+ group in Wisconsin. 5 individuals printed their names on the board of directors list when the GPU's articles of incorporation were filed. Those 5 names were Gerald Earl Myers, Michael Mitchell, Eldon Murray, Louis Stymack, and Donna Utke. The seemingly simple act of making their names public was courageous because state laws still viewed homosexuality as a criminal offense in 1971. As the group became official, lawyers tried to charge them more, banks did not allow them to open accounts, and the federal government refused to recognize them multiple times. The group published the monthly newspaper GPU News for about a decade once they got over some of those legal hurdles. The paper was distributed by GPU members, and people were encouraged to pass along issues to their friends. The editors also relied on readers to provide content for their issues. So, like so many of the early LGBTQ plus publications, GPU News was a do-it-yourself project and a labor of love. And then here on this slide, this is a screenshot from one of the book's pages. This is how the primary sources appear in the book itself. We really wanted to give teen readers a feel for what the primary sources really looked like and felt like to really try to connect them to these historical materials. So next up in chapter 2, we talk to readers about telling their own stories. This also gives us a bit of a chance to introduce the idea of oral histories to our readers who may not know or have heard of what oral histories are, and to tell them a bit about the different types of archival materials that are available for their own research if they would like. We loved the idea of teaching teens that their stories are also important and that stories like theirs exist in the historical record. So here's what we say in chapter 2. Some stories are spoken aloud rather than being written down. An oral history is typically an interview that is saved as an audio or video recording and shared through an archive. Archives keep papers, materials, recordings, and artifacts so that they can be discovered again and again by students throughout history. The digital Transgender archive is entirely online. It links to artifacts and oral histories held at institutions throughout the country. The archive features many oral histories with transgender folks of color, such as Selena Meza, pictured here, who recorded their interview as part of the Treader Transgender Oral History Project. Selena identifies as a Mexican-American, queer, trans, femme, assigned male at birth, and uses both they, them, and she, her pronouns. They're originally from Chicago, Illinois, and moved to rural Nakusa, Wisconsin, when they were around 5 years old. The Digital Transgender Archive has many recordings of stories like Selena's. So we use this section of the book to ask readers to consider, why is Selena's voice and story important to capture in an oral history? And how could your story add to our understanding of Wisconsin history? So then in chapter 3, we talk about the form of activism that is being true to oneself. We say in chapter 3, each one of us brings something unique to this world. Dressing and acting as yourself, having relationships with whomever you choose, pursuing the jobs you want and the passions you love. These are things that make the world a richer place. However, these are freedoms that US law and mainstream society have denied to LGBTQ plus people throughout much of history. Many individuals have been emotionally traumatized and physically harmed simply for being themselves. Yet there are many historical examples of LGBTQ plus folks who found creative and inspiring ways to be true to their identities, even in very challenging situations. We tell the readers, we hope these stories embolden you to take action by expressing your own identity. And sometimes being true to yourself is the most courageous thing you can do, as Jenny said in her introduction. So the source we want to tell you about here from chapter 3 is Donna Coleman, who appeared on that first slide in her very cool motorcycle and pants outfit. In the 1970s, gay women and gay men in Wisconsin could belong to the Forker Motorcycle Club in Milwaukee. The club's members chose to call themselves the Forkers, in part because the word suggests something that goes in more than one direction, like a fork in the road. And many of the group's lesbian members felt as though they had chosen the path less traveled. Donna Coleman was one of the group's co-founders. She served on the board of directors of the Milwaukee Gay People's Union from back in chapter 1, from 1974 to 1978. She was also a lifelong Catholic. She was involved in Milwaukee Dignity, a group offering affirmation and acceptance for LGBTQ plus Catholics. And then when she moved to Oxford, Wisconsin in the late 1980s, she formed and led the Lizards of Central Wisconsin. This group of lesbians aged 30 and over met monthly to socialize. The source we include in the book here is the Forker Motorcycle Club patch, which belonged to Donna Coleman. And Donna donated it to the UW-Madison archive in the year 2020, so just a couple years ago. Patches like this are usually sewn onto leather jackets, and they display aspects of the wearer's personality or identity. The crossed motorcycles on this patch represent the Forker part of the club's name. So then we ask the readers to consider what other elements of this patch could convey something about the reader's identity. Good critical thinking for our teen readers.
In our next chapter, we really kind of explore the idea of building a community. And communities can be big or small, public or private, formal or informal. Throughout Wisconsin history, LGBTQ folks have formed a wide range of communities in order to feel protected, get the education that they needed, and support one another. One of the stories we share in this chapter is that of Ted Pierce. He was a man born in Chicago in 1907 and moved to Madison at the age of 3 with his family. Ted's paternal grandparents had been born into slavery. He attended UW-Madison, worked as a tailor, and held a position in the executive office for 3 Wisconsin governors as messenger. He was always known for his unique sense of style. While he attended East High School in Madison, he earned the nickname of our fashion plate, a phrase used to describe someone who dressed fashionably at the time. LGBTQ people were not openly accepted in American society during the 1940s and 50s. Many individuals in Wisconsin were arrested for being part of what they called homosexual rings. Yet in Madison, Pierce was able to create a space for gay men to gather that he described as a magic group centered on the 700 block of Jennifer Street. The members of the group were known to have refined tastes. They dressed stylishly, they enjoyed fancy food and drink, and had cultured discussions about politics and art. As an African-American gay man in the early 20th century, Pierce cared about building a community where people like him could feel safe and free and to be themselves. In addition to maintaining the community on Jennifer Street, he also kept up long-distance letter writing with friends, really an impressive network of one. One of his longest-running correspondence was with a man named Willard Motley, an African-American writer who Pierce met on Madison's Capitol Square near his tailor shop. They wrote to each other for about 27 years. Motley's letter is pictured here on the screen and is what is included in the book, was sent to Pierce in Madison from when he was in Mexico, where Motley was living at the time. Motley closed in his letter with Pierce with the following words that really demonstrated their connection and the power and beauty of their relationship. He wrote, "And tonight, after you read my letter, look at Madison for me, at the campus, at the lake, at the beautiful things there, and remember that part of me lives there in Madison, as ever, Wilmot." Even in the 1940s and 50s, Pierce built communities in his own backyard and across the globe. Our final chapter then is Get Active. So we're at this example then of when people are starting to use the governmental systems that are in place in order to gain new rights and protect the rights they have. And the example we're going to talk about real change affected by Wisconsin's LGBTQ community is that story of Jamie Nabozny, who grew up in Ashland and came out as a gay teenager at 13. Starting in 1988, he was in 7th grade, and then continuing into high school, he was bullied about his sexual orientation. The high school principal sided with the bullies. She dismissed their behavior by saying boys will be boys. The harassment continued until 1992, when Nabozny ran away to Minneapolis. He eventually got his high school diploma and was admitted to the University of Minnesota. In 1995, Nabozny filed a lawsuit against his former school district and several school officials for failing to protect his 14th Amendment rights. His lawyers argued that Nabozny was being discriminated against because he belonged to a minority group as a gay teen. The lawsuit traveled through the court system, and Nabozny was ultimately paid $900,000 in damages. 3 school district administrators were ordered to pay the amount, and the school district was found not guilty. Nabozny's case helped to give young people across the nation more protections under the law, though. The lawsuit helped clarify the role of schools in bullying motivated by gender and sexuality. A federal law called Title IX, which protects people based on sex-based discrimination in the educational system and in government-funded activities, was also amended after this case and a few others. It helped set the precedent. The change required that all US schools provide a harassment-free environment to gay and lesbian students. Thanks in part to Jamie Nabozny's actions, kids who are bullied in schools today can feel protected under the law and have a course of action if they are not. Nabozny used the government systems that are in place and are meant as a check and a balance to get active and to protect his own rights, as well as set a precedent for other students in the future.
So, as we talked about earlier, activism takes many forms and spans a spectrum of ways of making change. The LGBTQ plus people, allies, and activists that we read about in this book changed the world by educating themselves, by telling their own stories, by being true to themselves, by building communities, and by getting active. These people made their own contributions to a larger movement. And over the decades, their efforts have added up to significant changes in this state and around the nation. Today, same-sex marriage is legal in Wisconsin and around the United States. Legal protections in housing, jobs, restaurants, and businesses for LGBTQ plus people are much more common than they were 50 years ago. And in fact, attitudes about gay rights have changed faster than attitudes about almost any other social issue in the history of the United States. So that's amazing. But unfortunately, attacks on gay people and transgender teens especially are ramping up again. And our hope is that this study of Wisconsin's LGBTQ plus history reminds us where we've already been. A little historical perspective can give us hope for a better future. Our goal with this book was to educate teens on Wisconsin's unique LGBTQ plus history, the good and the bad. We wanted teens to see how Wisconsin was at the forefront of the gay rights movement when it passed the first non-discrimination law in the country in 1982. We wanted teens to know that LGBTQ plus people have existed here going back to the Two-Spirit people among the Ho-Chunk, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi. We wanted teens to know that LGBTQ plus people are still here today and always will be.
And the great news is really that our youth are hungry for this history and this knowledge. The historical record of LGBTQ history generally started with court cases being the predominant sources. And we are still seeing court cases and legislation passing today. Each generation continues to fight new battles in this same war for equality. Within the book, we included some additional sources where youth can go to learn more. This book is by no means a definitive source. There is still so much to learn and so much to do. But our youth are powerful and resilient. This book is meant to celebrate their identities and give them a knowledge of the history that they continue to write today.
So we're very pleased to share that there is more on the horizon for this work. And we will include these links on our Facebook page, which I will give you an address to in just a moment. So first of all, we've compiled and made available an educational resource guide that's on the far right of the screen here that will help students and educators generate discussion and critical thinking questions. This is totally free for your use, and we hope it will be useful to you. So we'll include that link on our Facebook page. Also, very exciting, the Wisconsin Historical Society has sponsored a traveling exhibit with absolutely gorgeous artwork by the queer and Indigenous artist Nipinet Lansum. This exhibit is about the history of LGBTQ plus activism in Wisconsin. The exhibit is geared towards a younger audience, a teen audience, and we are very pleased to have been involved in the exhibit's production. So we'll include that link to order the exhibit for your own library, school, or other gathering. And then finally, I'm glad to say that we are happy to give book talks just such as this or any other type of format, virtually or in person. So if that's something you're interested in, please feel free to get in touch with us. We love sharing this history with a statewide audience, and we particularly love working with teens. So if you have a teen-centered event at which you'd like us to present or run a workshop, let us know. Here's how you can get in touch with us. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'd love to hear from you.